Good day, and welcome to today's session of the Public Intellectual Lecture Series of Far Eastern University. I am Leo from the Interdisciplinary Studies Department, and today's topic involves the environment and social justice. We have for today's guest Ms. Leah Guerrero, Country Director for the Philippines Greenpeace for Southeast Asia. Thank you very much, Leah, for accommodating us for today's session.
Thank you for having me here. I'm very happy to be at this lecture series.
Thank you, because the objective of the series is to be able to help students engage important social issues, and for them as well to be exposed not just to scholarly and research-based opinions, but also to help them formulate as well their own perspectives and hopefully act towards these particular initiatives and perspectives. So as I mentioned, today's session involves environment and social justice. Perhaps you could give us a broad overview of the global situation in terms of the environment. What are the issues that the world and the entire human civilization is grappling with, especially in terms of the environment, and perhaps how does this impact their everyday lives?
Big question. In terms of the global environmental situation, I think we could say that humankind is in a turning point right now. We are in the middle of one of the biggest changes that are happening in the natural world, and it is the global climate emergency. Okay. If you remember, in October 2018, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this is a group of hundreds of scientists from around the world, all climate experts. They released a report where they said that the world only has 12 years left to avert the worst impacts of climate change. To stay within the 1.5 degree threshold, to keep climate stabilized for lesser impacts on the whole of humankind. So that's where we are now. The world is in a climate emergency. And I think that based on that report, actually what the experts said was, although they are asking for drastic, really unprecedented action on curbing emissions that are causing climate change, because if we don't stop it by 12 years, it will be a runaway climate change, and we may experience the worst that the world has seen. In terms of impacts on people, we're already seeing it. The Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change impacts. We've seen it in Yolanda, Haiyan, the storm which killed thousands, I think around more than 6,000 people, the the most powerful storm ever recorded in history, in recorded history. Yeah. And we also see it in slow changes. We call it creeping climate change impacts. So it's days are getting warmer and warmer, colder nights are getting shorter, etc. In Europe, you see heat waves. They're currently in the middle of a big heat wave right now. And the world, every year, I think since 2008, is the hottest year on record. So it's consistent. So that's where we are right now, and it's actually impacting the climate crisis that we're facing right now. Is also interacting with a lot of localized environmental problems that we're facing. For example, local water shortages, pollution problem, deforestation. All this is worsening the current crisis and making it harder for people to cope with the impacts of the climate crisis.
Thank you. So we're talking about the climate emergency, and you're talking about the climate crisis, no? And then But there's one thing that I think should be highlighted, because you also mentioned that the victims of this particular scenario, of this almost extinction level event in terms of human history, are those who are in the impoverished nations and those who are impoverished in their own respective communities. So, given that it's a this is an emergency situation, and it has the are you saying that the most who have to lose, or the people who have most to lose, are in fact the people who actually have less already in life?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, you've actually hit it right on the head, the nail right on the head. That is the situation that's happening now. That's why, for example, Greenpeace and other organizations are fighting to gain climate justice for all these groups. So climate justice is actually, it's a framework of looking at the climate emergency from a rights-based lens. So you're looking at how the climate crisis, which is historically caused by fossil fuel companies and by richer nations that have been industrialized well before the other nations have. So looking at these impacts from the point of view of how poorer societies are how the rights of poorer societies are being infringed. So if you look at the climate problem, it's infringing on our right to life, right to food, right to livelihood, because it's going to cause more droughts. It's going to make coral reefs extinct once we hit the 2-degree warming. So all this is destroying nature, which is the basis of our existence, right? So it's really a rights issue for many people. And the justice aspect there is that those who are the most responsible, as you said, these are developed nations, for example, the US, and then fossil fuel companies, which have dug up coal, dug up oil, and released all this carbon in the air. They have profited so much from burning fossil fuels that cause the climate emergency. But those who are suffering, like people in the Philippines, people in Africa, etc., will experience the worst. In just recently, around a month ago, a UN rights expert said that the climate crisis, in the climate crisis, the rich will be the ones who will survive. So we see that both at the level of nations and also at the level of grassroots communities and so on.
But perhaps you can elaborate, why is it that rich slash industrialized nations tend to be the ones who not pollute but cause the crisis? What drives them to continue on with their directions in introducing or perpetuating climate crisis? And why is it that the impoverished nations, they're the ones who are mostly victimized? Because you're saying that there is a contradiction between interests. Now you have the richer nations, they're the ones who tend to consume and produce energy, and at the same time, it's the poorer nations who actually cannot meet up or cope up with the impact of these emissions. Perhaps you can elaborate further why such a disconnect between richer nations, poorer nations exists in terms of climate change.
Let me see if I understood your question correctly. I'll start with the story of the Paris Agreement. Yeah. The Paris Agreement was the agreement international. They call it a treaty also on climate change that happened in 2015, right? And under the Paris Agreement, all countries are supposed to do efforts to minimize their carbon emissions. But the problem with that agreement is that it is voluntary. Now, what does that have to do with your question? Yeah. If if your commitment for reducing emissions is voluntary, then you will not, a lot of nations would not do actions that will slow down their economic growth, right? And unfortunately, in the world today, even before the climate crisis became such a big issue publicly, a lot of nations are already at the parang many nations got a head start on industrialization.
18th century, 19th century, they were industrializing already since
Yeah. Exactly. So they got a really, really big head start from countries like the Philippines. And the countries that are left behind are, trying to imitate the way that they have progressed, their model of development. So that's the situation. And currently, the in a situation where a treaty is voluntary, for example, the Paris Agreement, you will see a very big disparity in terms of what needs to be done in terms of mitigating climate emissions, and what is actually being delivered on the table to help poorer countries cope with the impacts of climate change. Your question had another aspect.
Yes,
Yeah.
because I was thinking of when you were saying that the richer nations, it's their logical trajectory,
Yes.
as if they will
Uh-huh.
continue to consume fuel
Yes.
and they will continue to emit, will continue to have emissions, and at the end of the day, the people who will be paying the price are those in the impoverished nations. No?
Yes.
The question there is, why why can't that cycle be broken? No, why does that keep on continuing when in fact those who are already in the who have already been advanced or already industrialized, their movement should be towards reducing
Yeah.
and addressing the issues, especially since most of since most of the consumers of their own products come from these impoverished nations. They're profiting
Yeah.
from these
Uh-huh.
nations. Diba?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, the world today, when you look at the global economy, it's a very entrenched system, diba? You can't. It's very hard to change. That the economic model we have is based on unlimited growth, which these countries have pursued, right? So if you look at, there's some articles about it, about how a person in the U.S., for example, needs 5 planets to survive, while people in poorer countries only consume consume a lot less, right? In terms of, for example, plastic pollution, um, people in industrialized countries like Western Europe and the U.S., they consume 5 times more plastic than people in the Philippines, right? But we're burdened with their plastic imports, right? So it's the same case of richer nations having that early advantage over poorer nations, and it's a very hard cycle to break, like you said, because it is entrenched in our economic systems, in our financial systems, in our political systems, that fossil fuel based development is the way to go for countries to develop. Yeah.
But shouldn't technology have moved forward in such a way that, for example, if we are aware that current set of current technological equipment or current equipment that we have is producing emissions, producing pollution, given that this has been a problem, this is what, the 17th century or 18th century, shouldn't it have moved towards more renewable sources? Are there efforts both on a global scale and on a local scale to really introduce and move forward with the renewable sources of energy, as well as addressing issues of waste management?
Yeah, good point. Yes, there have been a lot of technological developments, but again, the system has entrenched big fossil fuel companies. They're the biggest companies in the world. They lobby politics, etc. They are within the system. They control governments, I would say. So it's very hard for them to give up their core business, which is fossil fuels, and then turn to renewables. That's what groups like Greenpeace are asking from them, that these fossil fuel companies need to abandon their fossil fuel businesses, and shift to renewable energy as soon as possible, because we only have a decade to avert or avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So, what should be happening now is that they should be, for one, acknowledging their responsibility for creating this big emergency that we're in. They should be mitigating, they should be stopping their fossil fuel businesses, and immediately go into a transition to renewable energy, which is just, equitable, etc. And government policy should be supporting that transition.
You mentioned about the efforts of Greenpeace towards pushing forward this agenda now of climate justice. In terms of the Philippine setting, how does Greenpeace view, or how does it perceive the efforts of both the government and also by other government institutions, other social movements, in terms of addressing this particular crisis, given that we only have just a decade, no, in terms of addressing it, no?
Yeah. So in the Philippines, we have initiated a petition with the Commission on Human Rights. The petition is asking that the Commission on Human Rights hold 40 fossil fuel companies accountable for the abuses to human rights that Filipinos are experiencing due to the impacts of climate change. So it's been, we submitted that petition to the Commission on Human Rights in 2015. And back in 2018, late 2017 to 2018, we had a series of hearings where a lot of experts went out and really built the case that these companies are really responsible. That our petition was based on a report by Rick Heed, who found in his study that only 90 companies are responsible for a big amount of the climate emissions, that historical climate emissions that is driving the climate emergency that we're experiencing now. In that petition that we submitted to the Commission on Human Rights, we are joined by a lot of communities, like fisherfolk communities, indigenous people communities, and climate impacted communities like the victims of Yolanda, in submitting that, in testifying that climate change is a human rights issue and should be acknowledged that these companies have caused their pain, have caused their suffering, and they should be held accountable. What we find really, beyond the case as a legal case, it's also proving to be a venue where we can really take a stand against fossil fuel companies, and broadcast that they should be held accountable for the historical and ongoing harm and future harm that they have done and are doing. And it's also a way for communities to assert their rights. Yeah, because this is not about parang protecting communities or giving them or helping communities. It's about communities standing up and asserting their rights, right to life, right to livelihood, in the face of this system where fossil fuel companies are running the economic systems in the world. Yeah.
When you say fossil fuel companies should be held accountable, of course we're talking about, you mentioned earlier that they should stop the extraction and production, distribution and utilization of fossil fuels and move towards renewable energy or less polluting sources of energy. But aside from that, what does it mean when they should be held accountable? What are we asking, or what should we be demanding from these companies, given that, as you mentioned, they've been profiting for more than for almost a century. We're talking about fossil fuels, so maybe around a century or so they've been profiting from this type of business, but harming also not just communities but also nations. So what does it mean when we say they should be held accountable?
Well, the first one is they should acknowledge their role, because not one fossil fuel company has accepted their role in the climate crisis. So that's a basic one. The second one is reparation for damages done, right? Once they acknowledge that they have been responsible for the devastation that communities, not just in the Philippines, have been experiencing, they should initiate a reparation for these communities. They should show plans that they are shifting away from their fossil fuel business and moving towards renewables, massively developing renewable energy. So to begin with, that's what we're asking for. In their language, we're asking them to close down. Yeah, because if your business is harmful to people, it's harming the whole human civilization. Then you should close down, right? After you pay reparation for communities. Yeah. We also see it in smaller scales. For example, not in the climate lens, but in localized environmental problems. For example, in the Philippines. So earlier we were talking about climate justice, which is very broad in the sense that its impact is global. When you put on a rights lens for local environmental issues, it's also looking at the justice that communities should be standing up for with the pollution, drought, etc., that they're experiencing in their localities.
Thank you. So let's just move towards waste management, because actually we're talking about it before. No, Filipinos, from a cultural perspective, they're not really a throwaway society. No, if you've seen like old houses, you'd see TV sets like 20 years old, and then you'll see recycled cups. Cups recycled from the tins of coffee, etc. No? We don't really throw things away, no? Which is actually a problem. It's actually our problem as a society. We don't throw things away, no? We keep them in our house, no?
Nag-iimbak.
Nag-iimbak. We don't throw things away for several. It might be too expensive, diba? O kaya, for example, it might have sentimental value. It's something to pass. Even cups of old coffee, of coffee jars, no? We keep it at home, no? And then you were talking about how we manage waste, no? Ang masakit kasi, no? Parang it's as if we're receiving the waste of other countries, because you were talking about Canada, and we become a dumping ground, no? So perhaps you can give the audience a broad idea as well, no? What is the problem in terms of Philippine society? Why are we having an issue with waste management? No, given that it's as if we don't really throw things away, no? Para, diba? It's there. I remember, no, if you actually look outside there, no, it's true, no, there is garbage, but not like the industrialized countries, no, where they leave 1-year-old TV sets outside their homes. And if we talk about environmental impact, definitely one big television set actually means a lot of waste. On a yearly basis, you're
toxic waste.
Diba? And it's not just simply plastic, but toxic materials as well. No? Perhaps you can talk about how we Filipinos perceive waste management in the Philippines, and why is it that it's as if our waste management issue is not just our own, but we're actually receiving the waste issues or suffer from the waste issues of other countries. No?
Good question, and a lot to unpack. Yeah, I was thinking earlier about your first question. What's the problem with waste management in the Philippines? What's the problem with our perception with our attitude toward waste? Yeah, and I can answer that in one word: plastic. Yeah, single-use plastic. Because if you look at it, the waste that we throw, if it's organic, it just goes back to nature. Yeah, or if it's recyclable, it goes back into the market. But the waste that we're seeing now that is quote unquote unmanageable is single-use plastic, like sachets, containers that are packaging, the plastics that are used to pack vegetables, for example, in the supermarket. They are used once, throw away in nature for 1,000 years. So that model, the problem with waste management actually only happened with the advent of single-use plastic. Yeah, before single-use plastic, waste was a lot easier to manage. So to give you a scale of single-use plastic problem in the country, if you look at our partner, Gaia Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, they did a report on estimating how much plastic sachets and plastic bags people in the Philippines throw out. And these are what end up in our landfills. So in 1 year, you could fill up the whole of Metro Manila with 3 feet of, a knee-high sachets. And that's not like crumpled sachets. It's like the computation was if you put the sachets
Flat on the ground.
yeah, flat, one on top of the other. That's how much sachets and single-use sachets in particular that we throw. So the problem with when you talk about waste, the problem is really we have products in the market that cannot be that are not biodegradable. That the only way to deal with them is either to put them in a landfill or to put them in an incinerator, which is both are equally bad. So attitudes toward waste. I would say that we're part of a group, a network of NGOs that promotes zero waste. Yeah. When you think about waste kasi, and even the term waste management, you're thinking about waste only at the end of the pipe. Yeah, when waste na siya.
Everything has been used up na.
Yeah.
That's waste.
What do you do with it when you're done with it? Pero if you look at waste management from the perspective of resource management, if you change the term, then you're looking at how to manage the material from the time it was extracted and produced up to the time that it was not anymore used for its original purpose but goes back to the market or goes back in nature. That is the advocacy that we're trying to promote here in the Philippines. It's called Zero Waste. And if you look at, I'm trying to connect this waste issue also to the justice lens that we've used. If you look at yung sachet problem kasi, it's also a justice issue, right?
Definitely.
It's also a rights issue, I think. Kasi these sachets, when you think about it, all that parang knee-high sachets na patong-patong, it's produced by companies and they profited from it. Pero they do not have any contribution to waste management of the city. So the city, kumare Quezon City or Valenzuela or whatever, they are left to use public funds, money from taxpayers, to do something, do something with the sachets. So every time you use a sachet and if you throw it away, it doesn't go anywhere but in a landfill. The producer who made it, the shampoo sachet, already earned from it, but they are not giving back any responsibility for the sachet that you threw away. So for the longest time, companies have been painting the problem as a litter problem. Like, it's your fault kasi you threw it away. Look, it's so dirty, right? But it's not that simple. When you throw it away, for us, it's still the responsibility of the company because they produced it. So they have a responsibility with managing the end product of what they produced. Because right now what's happening is the burden is on the city and the burden is on the consumer.